Ladies and gentlemen, I suppose that the best thing that's happened to the Yale School of Architecture in the years since I've known it is the fact that Louis I. Kahn was a member of its faculty from 1947 to 1957. And I'd like to announce actually that that little movie about Kahn will be shown in the British Art Center at 11 a.m. on Saturday. Now, Kahn, when he came here in 1947, was 47 years old and had built almost nothing, had designed very little. He'd worked very hard over the 30s through the Depression, but he had almost no buildings to build. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, and those reasons are essential to the development of his whole career. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1928 and took that year a trip to Europe, his Wanderjahre, and during that trip he made a number of drawings. Some of them he made with that little carpenter's pencil that you can see him holding there on the slide on the right. And on the other side is a drawing that he did of the medieval Italian town of San Gimignano in Tuscany in that trip of his of 1928. And you can see the way he uses the side of his pencil really to build the structure as if he's laying it up in horizontal courses. You see it through here. And at the side, where he's shadowing it, he's making a few very bold strokes with the side of that soft black pencil. But the general feeling is that with his drawing, he's building it up. And clearly what he likes is its solidity. You don't see any glass anywhere. You see heavy masonry masses, voids in them, and the sense of a ruin which stands there with an enormous physical presence. Then, much later, in 1960, he was able to put to use that memory of 1928 and to build what are, in fact, the medieval towers, like those of San Gimignano, for a most unlikely project for this form, for the medical laboratories, the Richard Medical Laboratories at the University of Pennsylvania. But when he came to Yale in 1947, all this was far in the future. And Kahn would talk about order and the search for order, but he never really knew quite what he meant. He wasn't at all sure what his objectives were, and yet, curiously, all of it was hidden back there in his youth, lost to him in the intervening years. For example, here's another drawing by him. Again, in that pencil, you can see him laying it up horizontally as if he's building the building out of masonry courses, in which it's clear what he loves. He loves these big, solid, structural forms in masonry and no glass. And he likes very much the sense, too, that these are forms in ruin, pure voids within the masonry walls. And then later, by the early 1960s, he's able to build heavy masonry masses with no glass, as if he's building ruins, solid walls, pure voids in them, no details, like a great ruin, in the subcontinent of India. These at the Indian School of Management at Ahmedabad. Or again, when Kahn studied at Pennsylvania, his teacher was Paul Kray. Now, Paul Kray was a French architect trained in the great Beaux-Arts tradition, and he'd been teaching in the States for some time. He, as a matter of fact, is pretty much the inventor or the developer of what became the major kind of monumental architecture in the late 20s and 30s. And this is one that in its own time was called stripped classicism or modern classicism. It was classical architecture, symmetrical, heavy, solid, permanent, traditional, which had, however, been scraped of most of its details, so it had some of the abstraction of the architecture of the international style, of which it was a contemporary, but was totally different from the international style architecture in the fact that it was symmetrical, heavy, massive, monumental, traditional, and respected traditional urban values. Now, this is what he was trained in. But no sooner had he graduated than this architecture became suspect and indeed became anathema to modern criticism. And the reason for that was that it was employed not only in the United States, where it had been invented, and where, in fact, all the great post offices and so on of the 30s are built in it, but also in fascist Italy. As we can see on the right, Piacentini's University of Rome, 1936-37, is, again, the stripped modern classicism. It has a strange scale, not nearly as solid and sort of rational as Craze on the left, but a kind of strange, nostalgic image of a classical past looming there like a dream over the streets of Rome. Or, even worse, in terms of the possibility of use, it also had been used by the Nazis because it fit one side of their purposes perfectly. It created a great image of a 1,000-year Reich that would last forever, permanent, grand in scale, solemn, ceremonial, in which the great aesthetic, and one has Benjamin use that word, the great aesthetic achievements of fascism, of Nazism, uniforms, banners, songs, lights in the sky, could play their part in hypnotizing and seizing, as in the 30s, the poor, sad socialists in their black suits and rationalized arguments were not able to do, to seize the imagination of the masses of people in many parts of the world. So again, because the Nazis had used it in terms of modern criticism, it became unusable for a while. Now, what you were supposed to do was be light and asymmetrical, like the Villa Savoye. And that Kahn could not do. He was absolutely trained not to be able to do that. And when he tried to do drawings like that in the 30s and early 40s, they simply disappear. They're hardly there. They carry no conviction. The line has no body, has no presence. You really feel that it's not sympathetic to him. And he struggled with this, along with the Depression and everything else, all through the 30s. And then the war made building impossible. Did a couple of housing projects. And then on into the late 40s, there was still nothing to build. And in 1950, again, the best thing that happened to him occurred. And that is he was made a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. So he went back to Rome, went back to his love, which was Italy. And he honed right in on a forum, but not the Forum Romanum, or one of the imperial fora, but to the forum that Mussolini had built in the 1920s and 30s. And on the right is Mussolini's forum with these steps, these pieces of sculpture, this blocky building, this truncated sort of obelisk or tower at this point, and that's what Kahn paints. There are the steps, there's the sculpture on its bases, there's the tower, there's that building, and he takes Mussolini's forum because that is the architecture he'd been trained to see. That is the architecture that, in fact, Paul Kray had invented. And he goes to that, and he does a beautiful pastel of it. He hadn't used pastel before. He'd used watercolor and that carpenter's pencil in those early drawings. Now he uses pastel, and it's an interesting fact that modernism cast watercolor into disfavor. Watercolor was supposed to be for Sunday painters, for the old-fashioned architecture. Modern architects were not supposed to use watercolor. It was supposed to be sort of decadent. So he never used it again, but he tries to get as close to it as he can, in a way, and he uses here pastel. Now, the other thing he did, of course, when he went to that forum and did that kind of haunted, empty cityscape, he was tapping in again to that haunting melancholy, that sense of many ages, of deep associations, long memories that's built into the culture of Italy, and which is most beautifully expressed and embodied by Giorgio de Chirico when he was a young Italian artist in exile, as it were, in France in the teens. And this painting of 1914 of the character of a day, you see, sets the stage for the long perspectives, the rather ominous shadows, the strange golden Roman light, the classical elements standing out in space that Kahn uses, with which Kahn indeed further endows Mussolini's forum. And I might say that the fascists, at their best, built that kind of architecture too. This is what now I think we all think of. We used to make fun of it. It was a major whipping boy. But I think it's the most haunting of all fascist projects and is now, as a matter of fact, one of the favored residential districts in Rome. It's the project that the Mussolini had built for what was supposed to be a big exposition, Esposizione Universale di Roma, in 1942. That was a bad date for Mussolini. The exhibition was never held, but looking down toward the House of Italian Culture, empty, no glass, hollow, like a Roman columbarium, a building of graves. You look down through the shadows, that Roman light, that incomparable light, and that's what Kahn picks up as well. And later, we'll see that's what the great Italian contemporary architect Aldo Rossi latches onto as well. Now, Kahn, therefore, in that year, 1950-51, he makes a trip, or a series of them, here through Italy, down through Greece, and finally to Egypt. As he goes north in Italy, he comes to Siena, and he looks across the great Campo, one of the incomparable spaces in the world that goes down into its deep hollow, and where the buildings are a continuous red brick wall that contains it. He looks at this view with the towers of the cathedral rising beyond it, and then you see what he does to it. He eliminates from it all the elements that give it specific scale. He takes away the windows, takes away the doors, and he just makes it one great big red color, which then blushes down into the square itself like some sort of strange reflection of color, and he turns the cathedral shapes green back there against the blue sky, and he makes the whole thing, curiously, more monumental, more timeless, more mysterious. You're not quite sure what those buildings are. And then, late in life, in his last decade, he builds exactly that. He builds buildings that look like ruins, that have no windows, that have no doors. You can't tell how big it is. You can't tell what it's for. You see it in red brick, reflected here in the water at Dhaka, at the capital, the so unlikely capital that he built for what was at that time East Pakistan, and then became the state of Bangladesh, and which he worked on for a long time in his last years. Now, or again, he goes to Greece. This photograph is taken from exactly the same place at Delphi, not knowing that Kahn had taken this pastel, made this pastel from this point, made a year later after Kahn. But that's the place to stand, with the great horns behind you, looking down through the valley of the Plestos to Itea, down there in the Gulf. But look what he's done to the light. He's taken it and he's made it hot. He's made it redder and hotter than Greece is. That isn't a Greek light at all. The same thing is true of the great temple. Watch the focus of the great temple of Apollo at Corinth here, where Apollo stands out, steadfast, without antithesis, immovable, against the great images of the goddess that dominate the isthmus, Paracara across the way, Acrocorinth that rises above him. But again, it's hot, reddish. He's after some kind of heat, some kind of color, some vegetable density and heat of form that really isn't in the lucid, clear marbles of Greece. Where he finds it, of course, at last, as if he had been imagining it all the time, is in Egypt. And you really feel that right there, all of a sudden, he's absolutely at home. He does this wonderful pastel of the temple of Ammon at Karnak, where he has these closed bud papyrus columns, which are very soft. They look like vegetable forms, weighted down by the entablatures. They're very thick, they're very big, and they stand in front of a wall here. And then some years later, that becomes the model for him for the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, which in Philadelphia, which unfortunately was never built. And it really is as if Egypt released his Jewishness in him as something that he could use, as if he'd made contact, as it were, with Pharaoh and with Moses and with the Israelites in Egypt. And this is the same. You see, these big columns become enormous. They stand in front of the wall, but now they're vehicles of light. He has windows in them on the outside with no glass. Oh, he's never sure whether it'd be glass. He didn't want glass. He never drew glass in them. And then inside, these big cylinders move out into the big meeting hall and offer places where a very small congregation can get together, or a big one when the hall is to be filled, and the light is being reflected off the inner surfaces of those cylinders, and it's being changed and made magical as it comes down into the space. And then, curiously, in terms of his Jewishness, about which a number of people lately have tried to show that he has a very close connection with Jewish mysticism. I don't know whether that's always true. I think in some places it is. It certainly is true in the plan that he proposes for the Mikveh Israel synagogue, which you see right here, which is a straight illustration of the so-called tree of the Sefirot from Kabbalistic Jewish literature, as we see it here in this Renaissance, a Jewish text, in which this, which is basically an image of the right order of the universe and its right articulation, is in fact taken by him. And this is very characteristic of Kahn, that what he was after was forms. And it's hard to find abstract ideas for mysticism in him. There was one great one that I'll mention later. But when there's a form that you can focus on, you can see him moving right to it. Here, certainly, especially appropriate for the synagogue project. However, the forms that started him, and from which his drawings and his projects become contemporary, rather than one being long precursing the others, those forms are the pyramids of Giza. And they are, in fact, the climax of his tour. And he goes there and he calls them a sanctuary of art, a kingdom of the shadows. He writes a little poem about them. And he loves to see them emerging in that hot light that he loves so well, each plane different from the other according to the light, and finally coming up where you don't see any diminution of plane at all, you have only that black mass in shadow with the light on the other side. Or again, he loves to look at them to see how, though they are enormous masses, you never read them as four-sided, which they actually are. If you look at two sides, your mind may supply one other, making it, as it were, a projected tetrahedron, never two. And in fact, the planes tend to separate into flat planes, one sand-colored, say, one light-colored, the color of the desert, one darker in the light. And he does these drawings so they're purely flat planes, turning into pure light. And indeed, when you approach most closely to a pyramid, the great mass totally disappears in favor of a plane that is sliding back without weight and disappears at a point in the sky. And Kahn's sense that this was the sanctuary of light is exactly in accord with the way these were in antiquity, because in antiquity they were all covered over with gleaming white limestone, so that they're all pure light. And they were indeed the images of Re. They were the way to get the pharaoh magically to the sun boat of Re, and they do it by embodying in the sacred mountain not the mass of the mountain, but the brilliance of Re's light. And that's what Kahn saw, and that's what touched him. And the thing, perhaps, though, that's most germane to what happens next, is that he studies this curious quality that as you look at them, you don't ever supply a fourth side. When you get an optimum three-dimensional view of a corner, if that were of a cube, the mind would project two other sides. You'd feel the cube. But the way those slant back, for whatever reason, the mind does not. And what he says instead is that there are these three-sided figures, some white, some black, some the color of the desert, all light. And while he's here drawing these, doing his pastels, he learns that he's received the commission for the Yale Art Tower of 1951 to 53. And when he comes back, what does he give the art gallery? The tetrahedrons, which are vehicles of light, in which, in fact, the lighting fixtures here are placed so that light may come from any one of these places. And overhead, vehicles of light, some of them light, some of them black, some of them intermediate in quality, are flattened out as pure light of the pyramids of Egypt, condensed, reused in his mind. Now, they were, in fact, condensed because they're put together with another long-standing, not really influence on Kahn, but a work that Kahn had always known well, and which he was especially close to at that time through Anne Ting, who was his major support in the office and who was obsessed with Buckminster Fuller and with Buckminster Fuller's work. And on the right, you have a cardboard, so-called geodesic dome by Buckminster Fuller, which is made, of course, in triangles, which in the end give a fundamentally tetrahedral effect. And while Kahn was working on the gallery, Fuller came to Yale. Kahn had already, in fact, though, chosen this scheme, but Fuller came to Yale and talked. Fuller, as you know, used to talk 8, 10, 12 hours at a stretch. He was a very short man. He would sit up. He would sit here if he were lecturing. He would sit here with his legs kicking, and he would talk forever. And it was a little like, say, for example, LSD for the student. It burned out the minds of a number of them, who in fact, throughout life, have been never able to really believe in it, really to believe in anything. If I start splitting infinities, we're lost here. Really to believe in anything except Buckminster Fuller's tetrahedrons, which are, after all, a very limited application in architectural problems. All you can do is make a great ceiling over everything, and all the other problems of architecture all of a sudden don't seem important, and you really can't do anything at all. But nevertheless, this is also there, and this and the pyramids are together there. Now, they gave Kahn what he wanted, and I might add that as it was finally finished, you can see it clearly here. They're not real space frame tetrahedrons like Kahn's. They are, in fact, braced beams. You see that those chords are bigger. They're braced beams which are braced by the diagonals. So, indeed, it's even a fraud from that point of view. What it is a great, powerful form that looms overhead, and which gave Kahn what he wanted, a big span, so that the big rectangular spaces could all be open. And in them, he could have these movable panels that he called pogo panels. So the works of art would be out on them, and the eye would always be able to go past them to this overall sort of universe of environment, which is defined by that great slab overhead. And you see what it is, if you can imagine the effect of it when it was finished in '53. This is the third floor in the exhibition at that time. There's that wonderful looming physical power overhead with sculpture, as it were, having an enormous intensity of life under that great threatening environment which is above it. Absolutely the opposite of what Mies van der Rohe had been doing just before that time, where you have great unthreatened volumes of space. The sculpture stands with a lot of space around it. The human act is in a great void. Here the human act is seen against a kind of mathematical, demanding sort of environmental law that weighs physically and very primitively overhead. Now, actually, none of these things are ever that simple, because Kahn's very first intention was not to use that kind of slab or those pyramids at all. His first intention really grew out of his knowledge of Corbusier's work. And you can see it just dimly in this drawing. He intended to have beams spanning in these directions with little vaults, little barrel vaults between them. You can just barely see it there. Then he got rid of that very soon and went to the slab. Now, it can't be denied that, seen in relation to this great art gallery of 1927-28 by Addison Swarthout, that Kahn's building is a diminution, a primitivization, an abstraction, again in a Miesian sense, to a point where it's almost not there in comparison with the rich, full, confident, sculptural, spatial forms coming up to the street, moving along the street, stepping back with the great vault that the older art gallery had had. Here is modern architecture in which he's absolutely involved, which is determined to be abstract. On the other hand, Kahn's instinct, deep inside, but not finding real release yet, is that it shouldn't be too abstract. So he brings out to the surface, as string courses, the floor slabs, which is exactly what would happen in a Renaissance palace, yet without the other wonderful elaboration that a Renaissance palace would have. But it's enough to define the movement down the street and give it a presence in relation to the other building. The other thing is, too, that as you see it, it's clearly just a cut-off box. It doesn't end in any way. And as a matter of fact, it never ended until Paul Rudolph, 10 years later, built its perfect complement across the street. Whatever you may say against this building, it is cited with enormous sensitivity and reverence to the Kahn building, because here you have that cut-off edge, you go look at it, which ends, and then that closed cube is embraced within that big gesture of Rudolph's piers right in here, and is completed across the way. And it's a wonderful dialogue that Rudolph picks up with the really very minimally cited building by Kahn across the way. And you see it especially if you look down the street. You see how you really lose everything without those string courses, and minimal as they are compared to those great arches, but how they do have a kind of velocity which Rudolph then completes. And if Rudolph's building weren't there, you can see it's much less that whole cityscape. So Kahn is feeling around for it. He's not at all sure yet. And the place you see it complete is from the courtyard behind, where you see from the outside what its basic structure is, where you have a central service area running right down to the middle of it, and then these open galleries on both sides where you see the wonderful slab. And there you see the whole thing. However, Kahn, sitting out here and looking at those triangles inside the rectangles, worried about it. He said, I have here what is basically a Mies loft space in a rectangular frame. Then inside it, I put something that really has nothing to do with it. I put this triangulated pseudo-space frame structure that wants to be triangles, that wants to be pyramids, that wants to be, and these are the words he used, because he is an animist, like any good architect. He feels the life that's moving through the structure and those forms of his. He says, I ought to do something else with it. And he studies the slab, and in 1955, he does this drawing. It's going to be a big mural. And he says, I look at that slab, and the light slashes across it, and sometimes it's like that. It's just like light. Then it turns black. But if I look at it properly, I see that every one of those is really four-sided. I see that, in fact, what's behind it is what I never saw at Giza, is a pyramid, a pyramidal form. And it's in that year, in 1955, that he makes what really is his breakthrough building, which is this little bathhouse for the Jewish Community Center in Trenton, New Jersey, which is a series of pyramids, four-sided, in skeleton wood and steel structure, covered with a typical roofing over the bathhouses and the central court below. Now, this little bathhouse is more than that, because it also, and here I don't show you the slide that compares with it because you've seen it so often. I'll let your mind project it. Now he goes back to the essence of the Western classical tradition, the circle and the square. And he studies it that way. And he has 5 squares, of which the outer 4 have pyramids over them. The central one is open with a circular pool or fountain. It's really only drawn on the surface in the middle. Now, and it's clear that he has a very definite source. And he certainly learned it from his French archaeologist teachers. It's the Romanesque Cathedral of Saffron at Paragon in France, where you have 5 squares like this, each one with a dome on pendentes over it. And there's the image. The other thing that's there is that with this building, Kahn began to talk of served and servant spaces. That is, major spaces, which are the ones you use, and then smaller spaces off them, which contain utilities, bath, circulation, and so on. And you see, you've got that here. You've got those 4 piers right here, which make, as it were, he could imagine these, and right here, like this, he's using the whole thing. And he's inventing, to his satisfaction, a new kind of functional justification for it in terms of served and serving space. Matter of fact, too, you can almost pick this up in Frank Lloyd Wright's Martin House, where he has a cross-axial plan, and the piers are 4, containing services within them. Kahn could have seen it there too, but he never looked at Frank Lloyd Wright. His whole group in the East Coast didn't like Frank Lloyd Wright very much, and I don't think he really did get it directly from there. It's from Saffron. Now, the other thing that's touching about this building is that here you have the most elegant, the most rarefied aesthetic of history, which is that Neoplatonic sense of perfect drawing in the circle and the square. Then you have it embodied in the roughest, crudest, cheapest materials, the only kind of thing that they could afford or that they could build with. Cinder block, staining there from the rain. Then those big, crude pyramids above them. And somehow that connection where he's disdaining the kind of fluid planning and so on that was characteristic of that period in favor of some basic, clear statement, however primitive could be its physical realization, that somehow, I think, is what's moving about the building, and most of all, too, its treatment of light. There, it comes into full 3 dimensions of what he learned at Giza. And what you see here in New Haven, most movingly when you look up in the stairwell in the art gallery, and you see the pure shape of the pyramid reduced to pure shadow against the light floating overhead. The sanctuary of art, the sanctuary of the shadows. And it's most touching, I think, again, in terms of his Jewishness and in terms of Egypt, that what happened to him is that those ancient Egyptian architects, Imhotep and the others, reached out and touched him and put him on his way, set him on his way. And that's really what occurred, because now, by the late 50s, he's liberated. And he's liberated to use, you see, what modern architecture had told him he couldn't use. All those historical ruins that he'd loved and drawn when he was a boy. And so then he builds what turns out to be his first really great building, the medical laboratories at the University of Pennsylvania, from about 1959 to 1961. There's one of his watercolors of 1928, of San Gimignano, with its wonderful competing towers. And there, finally, you have the family of towers standing there, like those of San Gimignano, about the same proportion as those here, with the laboratories, as we'll see in a moment, deploying here between them. Now, his very first project, again, for the medical laboratories, was a little more complicated than that. He wasn't going to have the towers simply coming down to the ground and being all basically alike. But most of all, he was going to avoid any sense of the towers as structural themselves. Therefore, he wanted to keep them off the ground. And he wanted to differentiate between the towers that carried the noxious gases, which is his justification for them, from the laboratories out, and those which house the stairs. So here you see stairs, and here you have all these tubes, ducts carrying the gases away. And where he's got those, he steps the towers out because he said as you get to higher floors, you need more ducts, so it's right to step them down and have them disappear as they come below. Whereas when you have stairs, then you cut out the bottom of the tower, like that, or like this, and not let it stand on the ground, and instead you have this sort of science fiction. And indeed, I don't have a slide. I should have. In England, right after this is published, 1961-62, Peter Cook and the others begin their archigram play, which is of a world made up of this kind of building in process. Towers rising, others spanning between them, always changing, always moving, mechanical, excited about mechanical and technical life, and a lot of it there derives from this drawing and these drawings by Kahn, which had an enormous effect in England. Now you see what you have. You have the towers. Then you have the great big columns, which support cross beams like this, and between them you have entirely open space on each floor, and the laboratories therefore may be divided as you see it here, any way you like. The fact of the matter is that the spaces are too small, as it turned out, for really effective laboratory functioning. Things have to be crammed in them. Laboratories really don't want to be in towers, I'm told. But one must say that the site is restricted, but most of all, you see, it's this image that Kahn wants. Now, as the thing is finished, he brings all the towers down to the ground, and they begin to look like San Gimignano. And sometimes when he has stairs, he'll open them above, but that's the only variation. And they're much bigger than the columns. So they were criticized by critics as looking structural themselves, being too big. And an English critic, Raynor Banham, the late Raynor Banham, wrote a very vicious article about this building, calculated to come out in the Architectural Review in England the very day that Kahn was getting the gold medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Example of good, vicious Grub Street English journalism, of which there's a good deal in the architectural profession. Now, in any event, what you have here, though, is a wonderful structure of precast concrete. And it's the first great precast building in America. See, each of those is a precast section, and that's laid down dry, like a piece of masonry without mortar, like Greek building, where the masonry pieces are laid down and the others without mortar in between. And then these big beams are poured that goes across, but these cords open are precast and are set in there, and they come out and they get narrower as they're bearing less as they come to the corner. So you start to get this wonderful bony structure that seems to have its own law. It doesn't seem to be just happening, say, the way Rudolph's building does, according to the whim of mankind. It seems, and of course this is specious, but it has this quality, especially on architects, there's a kind of structural law that's going on. And the place you experience it best, and almost the only place, is right there at the entrance, where you go into that wonderful, bony, for example, everybody said to Kahn, keep the glass back till you feel the thickness of the thing. He said, well, I don't know, if you keep the glass back, you have problems with the water, there's no reason to keep I'll keep it up in front. So he keeps it tight up to the front, and somehow it all does articulate. And Kahn said, I began to feel the crane as an extension of my hand, and each one of these as a brick that's laid down, and you feel how it's built, eminently built building, with the kind of dignity of that process. And then he has all those, this is an early phase where the towers were going to have even more complex shapes, but nevertheless, it all comes off the central building. These are all dependent upon it for some of their services, and what it does is make a community of towers, and it really does make very much a kind of San Gimignano. Now, one has said that this is perhaps not the ideal functioning set of spaces for a laboratory, but to me, a laboratory of this kind is a very strange thing. There are a number of people in Kahn's office who had to go in there late and make changes and so on after the building was in use, who couldn't do it because of the dogs crying in there under dissection. Couldn't do it. Had to plead with Kahn not to send them there, go somewhere else. And it really is a dark castle of pain as you see it standing there. It's got some deep truth in it. You feel in it that human, implacable will to stay alive at the expense of all the rest of the animal kingdom, no matter how. You really feel it in there. The building has it. There is a tragedy in it, not just the asepticness of the laboratory, but the tragic, professional character of modern man. And indeed, as those towers are in this wonderful competition, in a way, too, you feel the fellowship of work that is indeed the major fellowship that most human beings can know and that remains. Fellowship, the professional fellowship, has that too. Then he added a long string of biology laboratories, and they make a wonderful forest of buildings here, right on the edge of the University of Pennsylvania, with a little open land and a little bit of park behind it. But strange things happen here. For example, the glass, which we saw pressed up to the front plane, had no sun protection. So when you go there today, you'll see that they put silver paper up there. Those laboratories boil in the heat. And the same thing is true in these. But he decided to have a laboratory at the top. And the laboratory would have an intrinsic expression of carols, where you sat on a desk on both sides, and the light fell on the book from the little low bit of light there, and then above your head, so you didn't get glare, light flooded out above. The only thing is, when he finally put them in, there was, in fact, no library. The library was eliminated from the program. But he liked the way they sort of stopped the building. And you can see down below, he changes the detail. The glass is more, and it stops farther back. And somehow it's much less taut much less bony somehow than the other. You get the feeling he's going backward a little bit. At least certainly it was the feeling I had very strongly at that time. And he certainly felt it too, because his very next building sets itself above all else. What happened to the lights up there? The problem of how to, watch the focus. Why did all, good. The problem of how to bring light into a building, but to protect it from glare. And this is the Unitarian Church in Rochester, New York, which is built by the middle of the 1960s. And you see there are windows here and here and here, and they're all masked. They're all shrouded to protect them from glare. And then there are these high monitors, 4 of them, up above, which light back into the main reading room. But the only glass you see in the whole building is the glass that's up there. Now, the other thing about this building is that it's the first time that he articulated what is, I think, the most intelligent sort of design theory that we've seen in the modern day. And this is what he called the theory of form and design. And he said form, and it's not the way most of us would use these words, but no, that's the way he used them, and he makes sense with them. Form is what we already have in our minds. It pre-exists. Sounds almost Jungian or even Platonic. The form is there. And when we get a program, when somebody presents us with a new problem, we can, in fact, only think in terms of the conceptual stance we already have, which is true. So we supply a form. We supply a form from our minds, form in the mind, that seems to take care of that program. Then we bombard that form with the particularities of that particular program. And as we bombard it, it will deform to a certain extent, change under the demands, the specific demands. You see how he's mixing Neoplatonism and materialism. You might call a modern functionalism together. And then he says, if it deforms too much, it means that it was the wrong form in the beginning. We have to throw it out and start with another. He said an example of a form that was wrong in the beginning was the form that the church board wanted. They wanted a meeting hall on one side and then a binuclear plan with the school on the other. But Kahn said that form was no good because all the classrooms wanted to be close to the main meeting hall because often they wanted to use it. Therefore, that binuclear form did not hold, and it deformed so much that another form had to be chosen. He said the form that he wanted in the beginning, and here we are right back, is the circle there of the meeting hall and the classrooms right around it. And then that worked out, deformed, he would say, slightly, to this, where you have what's basically the circle in the square right here. And these are the classrooms, like that, and here's the great meeting hall. And then finally, as he presses on this, and some of these have to be classrooms and some have to be library, it deforms to the final shape. And you feel the tensions. It's really wonderful. When you look at this plan, you feel the tensions that brought it about. But the basic order, the basic clear, preconceived formal order of that out of which it grew. Here's the entrance, here's the library, there's a big kitchen, and those are mainly classrooms that go around here. And you see there's a wonderful bony structure here. See those 4 columns separate from the walls, which support, as you'll see in a moment, big cross beams here, which lift up a slab, which is rising to the 4 corners there, to which the light is coming down from above. Now, light is everything. And Kahn, in that wonderful way of his, talking about a classroom here, says, a man with a book goes to the light. So he goes over here to a window seat, which has a little window right next to it. And the wall is coming back in, so that window is projected from glare that lights the book in his lap. Then those voids between that window seat go up 2 floors, as you saw a moment ago, with windows on both floors, and then they're capped and enclosed by those walls of brick. And there's that wonderful little thing, a man with a book goes to the light, and you feel the light falling there on the pages of the book. And you see no glass. It's as if it had been built without the glass being invented, basically. And then up above, though, you do see it in those monitors, and they light down into what, watch the focus, right? what is, I think, one of the greatest spaces in my view, of the modern age. And again, you see, it's like that bathhouse. Here are cheap proletarian materials. I mean, there's a cinder block, or here it's concrete block. Then it's like a wonderful 19th century Gothic revival, bony structure of taut, hard, lean. How different it is from, say, Corbusier's big sculptural and dramatic forms. You feel that these are pure structure there. And then they hold a slab, which rises like that, wings over the space. And then down across these cheap materials comes this wonderful silver light. It comes from the monitors on both sides. And the whole thing is a great chalice of light. And in a curious way, the pyramids are not wholly forgotten, floating, as in the Yale Art Gallery, overhead. And then when you get to the outside, you see that all those shapes do derive from the desire to mask the glass. And with this exception, the building might have been built with no glass in mind. I'm sorry, it was burned at one time right here. Now, the other thing you see is, though, that that's as far as he thinks. The siding, you see in relation to the street, is primitive. It's just dumped down there. It has no base. It has no relation to the street. Not really. This is able to block it all. It goes across. The automobiles bump into it with no articulation. There isn't really sighted. But as you move down the hill around it, you can get, you see, as it changes in 3 dimensions, that sense that it is simply not really a building in a sense, but a great ruin deploying across the landscape. There was a show of American architecture in the Soviet Union in 1965. It was in Leningrad, that great city, and Kahn was asked by the, I guess he was CIA, I don't know what he was, American representative who was running the show, if he wouldn't go through with the Lord Mayor of Leningrad, who was visiting that day, and describe it to him. And Kahn said no, he wouldn't. And he didn't want to because he didn't like the show. The show was actually colored slides designed to knock out the eyes of the Russians with the splendor of our way of life. It had very little to do with architecture. It wasn't professional. Kahn said he wouldn't. But they pleaded with him. Finally, he said he would. And they went around. And when the mayor of Leningrad got to this building, he said, that doesn't look like a church. He said it in Russian. It was translated. And Kahn said, that's why it was chosen for exhibition in the Soviet Union. Our translator was a great square, and he wouldn't translate that. But the Russians all laughed like mad anyway, which shows that their English was probably excellent. In any event, it doesn't look like a church by Russian standards, those great vertical towers rising into the sky, but it is like a great ruin in which glass disappears, in which Kahn, you see, is beginning to build what he'd always wanted to build and what he loved, and indeed even deeper than what he'd been trained to build or what he'd turned toward himself. Now, then, watch the focus, please. And when he gets a chance to build this big center for biology research for Jonas Salk, who was the great hero of those days, the discoverer, the developer of vaccine against polio, he is able to design those studies which look out here into the central court as if they use no glass at all. Just bony armatures with voids in between them. And there is glass back here housing the laboratories, but it's very subordinated to the whole form. Now, this is the first example we have of where Kahn wants to base a form, which after all he'd been moving toward, after the pyramids that is, on a ruin, on a specific ruin, and upon the kinds of ruin that were going to inform his later architecture. And these were the ruins of Rome. Now, he was led to those in trips from the American Academy in Rome by the greatest classicist that he or I or anybody in my generation ever knew. That is the late, great Frank E. Brown, who died only just about a year ago at a nursing home in Florida after having lived most of his life in Rome, but with a very precious period for all of us as chairman of the classics department at Yale University and master of Jonathan Edwards College for a while. And I remember how moved I was to be able to talk to Brown in 1951 when I was at the Academy. I remember going up to the Palatine Hill and looking down at what was a great nymphaeum, a great fountain, probably by the great architect Rabirius, who was really a Baroque architect of the late 1st century, early 2nd century in Rome. And you're looking down, you see a form which is in a square, is a fanning pattern going out to the corners and filled in with these pie-shaped pieces there on the flat planes. Now, it's interesting that you could go to the concrete vaults by Pierluigi Nervi, great Italian engineer, at exactly this time, and the pattern, as you look up in his bays, are of this. In those areas, he would have the concrete thick with the steel in it, because that was the pattern of the moment of bending as he could calculate it. So it's all in the air at that time. Kahn looks at this too, and he has his studies, first plan for his studies are it's those. Then, however, he studies them further because he doesn't want them just symmetrical like that. He wants them looking in a direction. He wants them looking literally out to sea. So you have the big laboratories, and now he tries to perfect them. You have great big open space, so you don't have the problem you had in Philadelphia. Then each one is spanned by an enormous Virandal truss, which is high enough so human beings can walk in it and change the utilities, change the electricity around, change the ducts, all that stuff. So there are those serving spaces in the beams, and here are the serve spaces going across. And then you come out to the studies, one for each scholar there, and they are so adjusted that they're looking out like this across a courtyard. And therefore, there are two buildings like this with the laboratories inside them, and then these studies looking out, and they look across that empty courtyard, which actually, apparently, Luis Paragon, the architect and landscape architect from Mexico City, was consulted by Kahn and came and visited Kahn here. Certainly Kahn respected it enormously, and is supposed to have suggested leaving out the trees that Kahn was going to put here, and having only this thin stream of water, as in some of the courts of the Alhambra, running down between these buildings. There's the water in the center, with this wonderful view toward the Pacific. And it is a great view because these forms are so static and classic and permanent. They frame it. But right out there, above the beach, is apparently one of the favored spaces in Southern California for hang gliding. So as you look out there, you see Icarus. It's mad. It's absolutely mad. And it's absolutely the classic world, complete with its great myths alive as well. Now, Kahn didn't intend to stop there, though unfortunately he actually did. He proposed a housing group over here on the side toward the sea, and a big community center here. And that community center was going to consist of a courtyard like this and an amphitheater, around which were going to be these rooms, which were of glass, with glass walls. Some of them were square, some of them were round. Around the square ones, with their glass walls, were to be masonry walls pierced by windows with no glass in them. Around the round ones were to be square ones, and so on. So you had, as the facade of the building, ruins, as it were, without glass, of variety of shapes, which lighted inside and protected, he said, that he really wanted that, protected the glass walls from glare. Now, I think he had a very definite source, and it's this. These are the forum baths at Ostia. And Ostia is one of the places where Brown was at his greatest, with the wonderful brick and concrete construction and the great baths. And he had a student, Frank Brown, who in the 50s made a study, he was an engineer, of the forum baths, which you see here, which are now in ruin with the columns standing free and no glass in them. He had made a study of them, indicating that such was their orientation, and since such was the capacity for heating of the hypocaust in the floor, that they never did have glass, that in fact they were built that way. And clearly that was instantly a sanction for Kahn. He said, if they can do it, I can do it here, and he does what he wants to do. He has this great model here, these round ones and these rectangular ones with these wonderful openings in them, like those in Hadrian's villa. wonderful opening you get when you don't have to use glass, and you have a masonry wall curving in 3 dimensions so that the profile of the window curves too. The void eats in to the hollow inside, and that's what he created here. And indeed, this little shape, you remember he's building this for La Jolla, and the wonderful architect in concrete of La Jolla and San Diego, and even up in Los Angeles in the early 20th century was Irving Gill. And this is the Dodge House in Los Angeles, now gone, in concrete, with this little keyhole shape, which you find over and over again in Hadrian's Villa, and which Kahn picks up right here. So he's also picking up Irving Gill as well. Now, out of this comes what I think is Kahn's greatest drawing. At least it affected me at the time when I was writing the book about him in 1962. And I, too, was very worried about the medical laboratories. I thought the violence that was done to function and so on was problematical. Where was he going to go? But when I saw this drawing, I thought, I don't care. I don't care whether it works or not. I don't care function. That's not the point here. I hadn't seen, none of us had seen, a drawing of such Roman grandeur as this. Here's one of those great curved walls. And there, as in one of Nervi's vaults, you see, you have it thickened there and paneled back here to articulate the concrete down to its very thinnest section that will still stand stiff. And then a void comes down through it, the big keyhole window and these windows. And he shows the plan, asymmetrically moving down here below it. But then, of course, everybody said, well, that's beautiful, but what's he going to do with it? You have to have glass in buildings. You can't build buildings without glass. Well, there, Kahn, of course, had to laugh on them because he got the buildings in India and Dhaka and Bangladesh that didn't need glass because of the heat of the climate. So he built the India School of Management and Ahmedabad in India. And here he creates what he calls, in his classicizing sense, his brick order. Now, that brick order really derives, so he says, and one can see it, from his misreading, to use a Bloomian term, his purposeful misreading of the typical Roman relieving arch over a wooden lintel, as you saw it in the ruins, again without glass, at Ostia. And as you know, the Roman brick and concrete wall is built up by the mason of 2 walls of brick, up as high as he can get it. Then they pour the concrete in. It sets, and he caps it, and he gets up on a elevation, and he builds the walls up again, and then they pour, and they're afraid, especially over an opening, that if they pour, the pour before it sets and becomes a monolith will crush the wall below. So over an opening, and sometimes elsewhere, they build relieving arches, often of an open network of brick over the opening. And that's what you're getting there. And they're over what were originally wooden lintels down below. Now, if you reverse that, and you take the lintel to be a tension element in concrete, which is holding the vault together, and indeed, by the pressures of the vault, seems stretched as tight as a banjo string, that's what Kahn does. And he swerves off from his model to do this, and you got this wonderful intersection of those concrete things right in the middle where the vault is pushing into it. Now, having said that, which is true, there's another place he could have gotten them to, and that's right there off Chapel Street, right there on the block in front of the art gallery, the street hall, where a little alley runs down and back towards George Street. And if you go down through there and look to your right, you'll see this detail in 19th century buildings, right there. And also a detail where, right up here, the concrete is going up to a little shoe, as it were, to hold the vault. And so he could have seen it there, too, wandering around there between the buildings. But it also has, you see, a Roman sanction for it. And it comes out with enormous power. I mean, again, if I've showed slides of the temple of Hera II at Paestum, for example, with that sense of brooding, archaic, primitive presence, this certainly has it. And indeed, the other thing, too, if you get a flat-fronted wall with voids cut back into it, niches cut back into it, you can't help but think of the Indian architecture, things like the Taj Mahal. And yet how different this is. The brick is a primitive a grouping of forces, totally avoiding, as Kahn would do, all classical details, all decoration. It is a ruin which he's working with. And only the ruin will he work with out of the classical age. But he needs them. Now, I heard a talk by a well-intentioned fellow not so long ago, a modernist, who at the end of his talk said, therefore we see that Kahn was never a historicist. Well, actually, the opposite is the truth. Kahn was not able to come into his own until he began to be able to use literally the historical forms that he'd been shaped to admire when he was young. And behind his desk, in his wonderful office in Philadelphia, I say wonderful because unlike so many architects, he didn't have this great theatrical production of an office. He had a lot of people working very hard and paper all over the floor and ratty little cardboard models. But behind his desk, he had this great print of Piranesi, of the campus Martius in Rome, across the Tiber in Rome. And you see all those shapes appear over and over again. And you don't know, they look so strange. It's so abstract, but they're all in here. Find them all. He takes it right from there. He's looking for the forms, and he gets them. And this is the Indian School of Management. And you can see how strange it must look, coming from those strange shapes. Building up, then you can't tell the size, can't tell what it's for. They don't look like any buildings you ever saw before. They look like great elephants, all nudging and pushing with each other. You get the great circles. Stairs are behind them. Deep voids are behind them. One thing is behind one circle. Another thing is behind the other circle. It's always mysterious. But always through it, you feel not only Rome itself, but you feel especially Piranesi again. Piranesi's great etchings of the middle of the 18th century, like this one from his Vedute Romane from the 4th volume, where he shows building a brick circle here. And then these great circles, and they look in and look at that. And now what you're looking into here, through that outer wall, with the light going through, remember, and the heat being dissipated, presumably, and the air moving through, as through flues, right in there you see you're looking at arches going across from these piers. And what we're looking at there is this, right here, with a lower open floor, like chapels on both sides, side aisles, a nave in the center, a vault, really an arch going across, and then above, not a vault being supported, but a flat concrete slab, but you see what it is. It's a Roman basilica, a brick and concrete construction, and it's in fact another one of the great climaxes of Brown's tours of Rome, the basilica above Trajan's market, workaday world up above Trajan's forum. There you have cross vaults coming in like that, lighting in, because in a compression system, you have to have a vault to get the void coming into the barrel vault in the middle. Kahn gives up the vaults, but it's basically, as you can see, the same partie. He is building Rome in India, and he's building Roman ruins. It's madness, but it's wonderful. He's building Roman ruins in India. Now, they're very direct. Here's the little hot drink stand in Ostia, the so-called Thermopolium, where hot drinks were served, where arches run across without columns to the ground, just barely overhead. And that's the way Kahn builds those wonderful cryptoportici, which are themselves Roman, used by Jefferson, too, at Monticello, which go around underground in the cool and connect the buildings with each other. The arches swinging across, there they are. One could blend right into the other. Or even more startling and stranger, here's the temple that stood above every Roman town, the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, from the Capitol line, who was always placed close to the major forum. He's placed on a height, marble stairs, and the accidents of erosion have made the thing come into two flat planes like this, standing at the top of the marble stairs. In the walls are the relieving arches, articulating the walls with these geometric shapes. And then from that, we can go very easily to the main assembly building at Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. There are the marble steps. There are the two flat planes of wall, standing up flat and open to the sky, with no sense of roof. And there are those shapes, some rounded, some triangular, like the Roman relieving arches there in the wall. Now that building, of course, too, is a condensation of almost everything that Kahn loved, and of so many of the things that he worked on all his life. The central hall is right there in the middle, here. Then around it, and all of them hollow in one way or another. So all of them, like the Mikveh Israel synagogue, vessels of light. They're letting light flood into them, and then through them into great spaces, and through those into the hall itself, as well as light from above. You have this wonderful set of shapes which also connect, in Kahn's mind, very much with his love for medieval castles. And what he loved about castles, and this is a drawing that he owned, is that they had very thick walls in which you could have rooms, little rooms, basically, opening out here to windows. So they became vehicles of light. And you had these wonderful triangular ones, you had round ones, you had all kinds, you had a whole world of spaces in the thickness of the wall. The light came through those into the central spaces, and that's exactly what's happening here. There are those thick castle walls, there are all those shapes, and there is the light moving through inside to those fantastic spaces of no scale at all, which are now getting very classical, but without the classical details. There's the pediment, but it's the pediment in ruin. It's the ghost of the pediment. He won't go any farther. He won't use those details. And I must say in that he was a little bit like Frank Brown, because Frank Brown wrote what is without question the greatest book ever written about Roman architecture, despite the fact it's tiny. But in that book, he kept being asked to say some more about the details, say more about the decoration. And he, and I realize now, is himself very much a modernist, he'd say, no, that's all that old stuff. That's that old history. We'll just stick to the essentials here, especially since it's so short. And this reflects that very much in the form as a whole. And the other thing, if you go from the assembly hall out to this strange reflecting tank, this pool, and come to what would we say this is? It's housing. But who'd ever know it? There's no scale. You can't tell what it is. And it floats on the water, as this one does, magically, permanent, no glass, no function, like some great monument to a civilization long gone, changeless. It's amazing, really. And that's what he's after. That's what he's after. Timelessness, everlastingness. There's one building that isn't quite like that, which I find one of his most moving. It's the outpatient clinic for the hospital, in which he has, you see, a series, he disguises them until first you don't realize they're big circles, like this, through which he runs, just like the Piranesi drawing, this arch, this a vault to hold it together. Originally, there was no glass up above. That was put in after the war with China when they needed more room for the casualties up there. So you must see that as a void. That's what Kahn intended. Then, as those circles go along and make the front of this building, Kahn thinks that some places he needs concrete ties to hold it together. He doesn't think he needs it everywhere, but he has it some places. So you have it here. And then you get that wonderful sense of that thing holding the circle together in front of an eye. And it really is like looking into that famous eye that Ledoux draws way back there in the 18th century. Strange eye that's in the building, but which is really lighting through into another of Kahn's great spaces, in which his talk about institutions, when he says, what does the institution want to be, here really makes sense, because the patients are treated way back there, but patients in India, when possible, are apparently accompanied by their whole families, who come and stay with them and support them and camp here, are here. So it's full of people and of support for the patients. The whole village comes with them, as it were. Life goes on. It's a wonderful thing, really. And again, you see it's the light coming through, step by step, through the great ruin, down through that great luminous hall, without glass of any kind. And I think probably the space by Kahn that rivals it is that of the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, which, as you see it here, as it was published in 1972. There he develops the galleries as Romanoid, though they're not half round, Romanoid vaults, rounded overhead. And then with an elaborately worked out system to filter the light as it comes down in the slits that are up there in them. And it does make wonderful interior spaces. But in a curious way, the building has no outside at all. It's placed at the bottom of a long park, which runs up in this direction. So when you come down this way, maybe you see those tiny trees right there. It's the one place that the building on the outside makes sense. You come down from the park, and you have these pavilions, like pavilions in the park. Johnson's Amon Carter Museum is up the top of the hill. You come down here, you walk with those trees your size, they walk with you, into a wall of glass behind us, the only glass you see, which is the entrance. The only thing is, that entrance is now always closed up, or almost always, for security reasons, and everybody enters from the other side, from the parking lot, which is totally undesigned, and in which you see the building is not a building on the outside. It's like a warehouse that goes along, and the entrance, which is over there, really needs fundamentally to be reworked, because then that's now the entrance that people use. So you feel that Kahn here is very caught up in Rome, and it works marvelously inside, but his masking of the glass and his refusal to think through a lot of siting problems and adding problems makes it a problematical building on the outside. Now, when he gets to Exeter, he really tries to deal with the problem of the glass, because here now what he's been happy doing is building without glass. Now he's got to get it in. So in Exeter, he builds 4 walls that he tries to make as much look like freestanding walls, that is walls in ruin, not really connected with a building, as he possibly can. And I might say it's simply dumped down on a flat grass plot near the main street. Can hardly say. I've heard people rhapsodize about its siting. I don't see that it is sited. It's just dropped there. And then this is what he does at Ahmedabad, where he has to have glass in places way, way back, so you can't see it. But here, he brings it in what is basically the same structure, like a room, brings it right up to the front. And it's exciting. And again, it's a little bit like that glass earlier, where he doesn't fool with it, he just brings it up there, as if he's really setting it in, without reveals or anything else, in the ruin. Then, the other thing is that the building has no entrance, really. You can hardly find, where's the entrance? You can hardly find it. He hasn't really, so finally you do find it somewhere, and you go up inside these heavy, big, but primitivistic concrete details, and when you get inside the square, on all 4 walls rise these great concrete circles. So again, it's perfectly the circle and the square at fantastic scale to the size of these elements compared to people here. And behind it, you get stacks and wonderful places to read up there by the windows and so on. But it's a very strange, magnificent. Always, it is, again, the ruin, the majesty, the timelessness, beyond, as it were, what would appear to be simple ideas of use. Those really don't, in the long run. No, that should be on the left. That's on the left. That one is on the left. Yeah. Now, when he comes here to New Haven, this is the miracle, that all of a sudden he throws all that out. And he goes back to what is basically, in the end, the root of the tradition, the classicizing tradition in which he'd been brought up. This building, after all, is made of a steel skeleton of no great section, not overwhelming in size, in which panels, some of them opaque, stainless steel, some of them glass, are set right up to the surface. Now that, of course, basically is what Mies had been doing. Basically, at IIT, Mies had worked in steel, not concrete, and with brick rather than stainless steel, in that system of the frame with the infilling panel, which in the end goes back, as you know, to the Bibliothèque Sanction of Yale. The whole creation of that system in Paris in the 1840s of the skeleton of structure, the infilling panel, part opaque and partly glass. And the Bibliothèque Sanction of Yale is powerful because of this great string course here above the entrance level. Now, so is this building. And the reason Kahn has it is because of a student demand. As a matter of fact, it's the only student demand, other than the destruction of the first term, which was granted in the revolutionary years of 1969 and 1970 and right then when Kahn was first looking on that. Because the students said, and they were supported by the city of New Haven, they said you've got to have some kind of commercial use down below. You've got to have stores or something. Now, that gave Kahn the lead that he needed to do what he'd never really done before, to give it some kind of relation there to the street, to the first floor. So it enables him to have a first floor which has a different function, as this does here, and then to have a big element coming across, defining the floors up above it, the 3 floors up above it, which have another kind of function rising there. Now again, this building was not the first that he vastly across the face of each building was a big, low, flat concrete arch defining the street. And it would have been much more dramatic, much more lively than this one. This one, of course, it's a curious thing about humanity. You get used to things. But when I first saw this going up, after having seen what the other was going to be, I felt it was really very stiff, very dead on the outside, especially that mat here, which I thought was slate at first. It looked like slate. It doesn't look like stainless steel at all. Absolutely matte, dead surface. A little like the slate that Kahn had used at Bryn Mawr in galleries, in dormitories that he'd done there. In any event, this is the way it came out. Something very close to that whole tradition of Mies and of Labrousse as a whole. And of course, that is, in the end, the great thing about Kahn and about that building is that he really learned to build. So that every time you come to an intersection, you feel its gravity. You feel how it's the product of thought. Now, it's not cheap. This kind of modern architecture, that concrete, that stainless steel, you could have clad that whole thing in cut limestone, probably at half the price, and with much more complicated detailing. Whatever the case, this is concrete technique, the primitivism of bringing it down just to what you can build without details, but exact. And with that sort of dignity and gravity that comes from a man who knows how things go together. I might say, knowing how things go together, though, that wonderful lift there produces icicles that drop on pedestrians in the winter. And anyway, but that's neither here nor there. Can't make an omelet without breaking pedestrians. Anyway. Now, the other wonderful thing, of course, is the glass. This glass, with which he'd had so much trouble, and which he completely eliminated, now all of a sudden you see the way he brings it right up the surface and has no reveals, it really begins to reflect. And that reflection is set off by the fact that these are so matte. And what it reflects, of course, is not only the sky, but all those wonderful old buildings across the way. The Gallery of 1928, his own building, but especially those great big Romanesque and Gothic details that move thunderously through his flat and otherwise very dead facade. Give it a dimension, time, memory, his own beginnings there across the street. It is really unbelievable that he had a chance to build there at the last, because it's basically his last building, and was finished after his untimely death in 1974. And the class, of course, is going to go through this with the TA, so I won't say too much about it, but it is, again, a primitive classicism for all its elegance, devoid of details. In that, he's still holding it away to the ruin. He calls with this wonderful paneling, as he wants to the English country house and its great halls. So one feels that that's appropriate. But of course, it's far away in its suggestion. It goes up to strange, wonderful lighting coming down from above, standing with this enormous, terrifying silo, the enormous scale, this great golem, this giant that stands there in the middle of it. And then with those wonderful openings there, lighting in from the courtyards into the spaces which have a very small bay system, the one you saw here and on the outside, precisely so that it would be different from the gallery across the street, and nobody could change it, because it broke Kahn's heart. And when Rudolph and Ritchie, who was the director of the museum after Kahn, who had been at the Museum of Modern Art, redid Kahn's spaces to make them look like the Museum of Modern Art. And Kahn never forgave, I'm sorry to say, Rudolph or Ritchie for it. But he said, now nobody's going to be able to do it. Bay system is so small, they have to stick to it. There's nothing much they can do. However, it's much more than that. to me, the most wonderful place in it is that window right near the great constables and so on, where you look out on what is really one of the great groups of buildings, well, I think of our time. They go all the way from Bingham to Rudolph's A&A on the other side, which are a real conversation between the generations, 1860s, 1920s. You look out on these, it's really like a lens. They stand so clear out there, right up the street, from the 19th century past, right up to his own early building, and then to Rudolph's gesture to complete it across the street. Thank you.